registration is up in the United States, with politics making headlines every day and midterm elections that will decide which party holds the U.S. House and Senate coming up. That's not a surprise. But what is notable is analyses from multiple sources showing or projecting that women are outpacing men in registering to vote by double digits in some states. While Ohio does not ask for gender on voter registration forms, there is data that suggests that that is happening here, too. The Democratic political data and data services firm Targetsmart has been looking at publicly available voter registration data from Ohio and around the country since the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the landmark decision legalizing abortion in June. In Ohio, Targetsmart estimates women have outpaced men in registering to vote by 11 points. They're younger. More than half of those new registrants are under 35. Overwhelmingly, they live in cities or suburbs. And with all that data and others considered, as a group, they're more likely to vote Democratic than Republican. Tom Bonnier is a Democratic political strategist and the CEO of Targetsmart.
So the majority of the data that we collect is data that's provided by the state. It's publicly available voter data. What we do is we just aggregate it and we compile it so we can view it in the context of past elections. We do then append other data sources, sometimes consumer data sources. We also build predictive models. But from a partisan perspective, it's incumbent upon us to make the data as accurate as possible, meaning there's nothing to gain by trying to skew the data one way or another. The campaigns we work with need accurate data.
So when you talk about getting the numbers from the state, I want to ask you about specifically gender. And I looked up the Ohio voter registration form, and I've got it right here, and there's no space on here for gender. So how do you come up with a gender description or put people in a specific category in Ohio when it's not on the form?
So what we do is we use that publicly available voter file as the base for the analysis, and then we append all sorts of data from a bunch of different sources, literally thousands of different variables. A lot of these come from commercially available consumer databases. Think about the marketing databases that are used by companies when they're advertising to individuals. And so that data is a lot more, it has a lot more depth than the publicly available voter file. So one of the variables that we append is gender.
And indeed, some of these variables, even the political parties do this to try to find voters that they can persuade and that sort of thing. So what you're doing here is not completely unique to what you do. It's a lot of data services are doing the same thing.
Yeah, that's right. This is a very common practice on both sides of the aisle. The era of big data in politics is something that began some time ago. It's always evolving, and there's always more data being brought to the table. But it's something that is pretty commonplace at this point.
So what did you find as you were doing this modeling? What did you find when it came to Ohio's voter registration? And you've been really looking at voter registration since the U.S. Supreme Court's Dobbs decision in January.
That's right. I think there was an open question in terms of how that Dobbs decision would impact the November elections. Understanding that it's a landmark decision, there's no real precedent for this in terms of a 50-year Supreme Court precedent being effectively vacated. And I think there are a lot of theories about how this could impact the election, but not much data. So we began to dig into the data. And the first place to look was voter registration. We don't want to wait until the election takes place to begin to have a sense of who may be impacted and how. And so we could look at real-time voter registration data. So we set June 24th, the date of the Dobbs decision, as the inflection point. And we looked at the voter registration trends in Ohio before June 24th and then after. And what we found was a very stark difference where after June 24th, women started registering to vote in Ohio at a much higher rate than men. Prior to June 24th, when you look at the new registrants in Ohio, they're roughly even between women and men, which is generally what you would expect to see. After Dobbs and since Dobbs, women have an 11-point gender gap advantage over men among new registrants.
Now, you can't determine gender conclusively from voter registration forms, but you can determine age. And it's I believe you found that voters, especially younger voters, are registering in big numbers.
That's right. When you look at those new registrants, generally they do skew younger than the average voter for obvious reasons. A lot of times it's, when people are just turning 18 or getting their driver's license, they'll register to vote. But what we found similarly is since the Dobbs decision, the voters who are registering to vote in Ohio are much younger than they were before. At this point, with the latest data we have, 58% of those voters who have registered to vote in Ohio since the June 24th Dobbs decision are under the age of 35, which is a pretty significant increase from just before that period.
Now, while that's a significant increase in voter registration numbers, we can't necessarily translate that to what might happen in November, because this is a voting bloc that just doesn't turn out to vote as much. In fact, they're the lowest turnout bloc.
That's right. The big question now is, does this surge in intensity and in enthusiasm that we're seeing in voter registration translate into turnout? At this point, no one will be able to answer that question until Election Day. We did see in 2018, there was a similar surge in registration among younger voters that did eventually translate into an increase in turnout among younger voters, but time will tell if that's the case in this election cycle.
In Ohio, this state has been red for quite a while. 5 executive offices, supermajorities in the Ohio House and Senate, majority on the Ohio Supreme Court. Though in this last year, the Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court has sided and agreed with the 3 Democrats in ruling that our legislative and congressional maps are unconstitutional. Those are being used, even though they're unconstitutionally gerrymandered, in this November's election. Our congressional map has gone from 16 to 15 and likely to once again be dominated by Republicans. So in a state that really has a history of a lot of Republican election wins, how do you think Democrats and Republicans are going to do this year? Is there any way to extrapolate from the data you have?
Well, the big question is, how valuable is that past precedent? Or to what extent did Dobbs shuffle the deck enough that we'll see something different happen? And again, no one can answer that question until the election happens. I think Democrats looking at Ohio maybe take some hope from looking at results in Alaska, where Democrats picked up a House seat in a very red state. You look at Kansas and the ballot initiative there, where the pro-choice position succeeded surprisingly by 20 points. Again, Kansas, a very Republican state. And so there's some evidence that perhaps the past precedent and the historical trends aren't going to hold to form perhaps as much as they have in previous elections. But again, time will tell.
And what can you tell about the people who are registering in Ohio? Again, you can't know some things like gender. You also can't know whether people are registering as a Republican or a Democrat in Ohio, because we don't do that. We are the only way you become affiliated with a party is to vote in a primary for somebody from that party. So what can you tell about the people who are registering in Ohio and what party they're likely to fall into?
So we do build predictive models on partisanship. They're far from perfect, but they do provide a good indicator. Because of the data sets that you mentioned, we have a good sense of what a Democratic voter and what a Republican voter looks like. And we can rely on the different variables we have at the individual level on these voter files. And so from a comparative sense, what we can tell is that the voters who are registering to vote in Ohio and who have registered since the Dobbs decision in June look a lot more like the Democratic voters who are already on the file than Republicans. At this point, by almost a 2-to-1 margin, when you look at just those women voters who have registered since Dobbs, very substantial margin where they're much more Democratic leaning from the model perspective than those who are registering prior to Dobbs.
There are about 7.9 million registered voters in Ohio now. Since 1994, Republicans have won all 5 statewide executive offices of governor, attorney general, auditor, secretary of state, and treasurer, except in 2006, when all those offices but auditor were won by Democrats. Ohio has had 1 U.S. senator from each major party since 1969. But between 1975 and 1995, both senators were Democrats, John Glenn and Howard Metzenbaum. And from 1999 to 2007, both were Republicans, George Voinovich and Mike DeWine.